A dedicated nurse caught in the crossfire of cartel violence, Isabella flees for her life when accused of betraying a powerful drug lord. But as her past unravels, she discovers a secret about her father that changes everything and puts her in the center of a deadly war. Isabella leaned against the cold, peeling walls of the clinic, her hands steady as she wrapped a bandage around an older man's arm. Outside, the faint sounds of the city reverberated, laughter from children playing in the distance, the hum of a motorbike, and the occasional sharp crack of gunfire that sent a chill through her spine. This was her life, a dedicated nurse in a city shadowed by the violence of the cartels. Yet amidst the chaos, she found purpose. Tonight was unusually quiet. She returned home to the modest two-room house she shared with memories of her late mother and the well-worn photo of a man she'd never met, her father. As she boiled water for tea, she allowed herself a rare moment of peace. The city, it seemed, had taken a breath. That illusion shattered as the door burst open, splintering wood flying across the small living space. Isabella froze, her heart pounding as three men stormed in, their faces masked, but their eyes cold and menacing. Each carried a weapon, their movements swift and purposeful. "Isabella?" one of them growled. She nodded, her throat dry, hands trembling as she set the kettle down. "You've been talking to the wrong people," another man hissed. "Alejandro doesn't tolerate traitors." "Alejandro?" she repeated, bewildered. She knew of him, of course. Everyone did. Alejandro was one of the most feared narcotraficantes in the region, a shadowy figure whose power stretched beyond borders. But why her? "I think you've made a mistake," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. The man closest to her raised his gun, and instinct took over. Isabella grabbed the hot kettle and hurled it at him, the scalding water splashing across his face. He screamed in pain, dropping his weapon. She didn't wait to see the other's reactions. She bolted for the back door, her bare feet slamming against the floor as adrenaline propelled her forward. Outside, the narrow alleyways she knew so well became a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. She ducked behind crates, her breath shallow, as the men shouted and scattered in search of her. Her mind raced. Who could she turn to? What could she do? "You can't run forever, Isabella," one of the men yelled, his voice echoing through the night. "Alejandro doesn't forgive. He'll find you." She bit her lip, suppressing a sob as she slipped into the deeper darkness of the alley. Her thoughts flickered to Carmen, her closest friend, the only person she trusted implicitly. Somehow, she made it to the main street, her hands gripping her sides as she tried to catch her breath. The promise in their words lingered, though. Alejandro would pursue her. As the lights of the clinic faded behind her and the cold night swallowed her, Isabella knew one thing with chilling certainty. This was just the beginning. Isabella stumbled through the narrow streets, her breath ragged and her heart pounding like a war drum. Every shadow seemed alive, every distant footstep a harbinger of her pursuers. But there was one place she knew she'd be safe, at least for the moment: Carmen's home. Carmen's small apartment was nestled in the heart of the city, above a corner store that always smelled of fresh bread. Isabella knocked rapidly on the door, her voice barely above a whisper. "Carmen, it's me." The locks clicked, and Carmen's face appeared in the doorway, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm as she took in Isabella's disheveled appearance. Without a word, she pulled her friend inside, bolting the door behind them. "What happened?" Carmen asked, guiding Isabella to a chair. "You're shaking." "They came for me," Isabella said between gulps of air. "Alejandro's men. They think I betrayed him." Carmen's eyes widened. She sat across from Isabella, leaning in. "Why would they think that? What have you done?" "Nothing," Isabella's voice cracked. "I don't even know why I'm a target, but they mentioned Alejandro by name, and they knew where I live." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "They won't stop until they find me." Carmen hesitated, her fingers nervously tapping the edge of the table. "Isabella, there's something I've never told you." Isabella frowned. "What do you mean?" "There's a name," Carmen said softly, her voice almost drowned out by the hum of the refrigerator. "Don Rafael." The name hit Isabella like a punch to the gut. She'd heard it whispered in stories of old power struggles, a ghost of the past whose shadow loomed over the region. But it was also a name she associated with her mother's tear-streaked face on those rare nights. She allowed herself to speak of the past. "Don Rafael," Isabella repeated, her throat tightening. "What does he have to do with this?" Carmen hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table. I don't know everything, Issa, but your mother, she once told me he was important. To you. To me? Isabella leaned forward, her frustration mounting. Why are you telling me this now, Carmen? What aren't you saying? I didn't want to burden you, Carmen admitted, her voice trembling. But if Alejandro is after you, it could be because of him. Isabella stared at her friend, her thoughts churning. Could this mysterious connection to Don Rafael explain why Alejandro's men had stormed her home? And if so, what secrets had her mother taken to the grave? Before Isabella could press further, Carmen's phone buzzed on the table. The two women exchanged a glance before Carmen picked it up, her expression darkening as she read the message. You can't stay here, Carmen said, her voice firm. If Alejandro knows where you live, he'll find you here too. We need a plan. Isabella nodded, her determination solidifying despite the fear gnawing at her. Whoever Don Rafael was, and whatever secrets he held, she was done running from her past. The cold air clung to Isabella as she made her way to the old church on the outskirts of the city. Carmen's words haunted her. Don Rafael might be the key. She needed answers, and there was only one person who might have them. Father Tomas, a priest who had been close to her mother years ago. The church stood solemn and quiet, its tall, weathered steeple piercing the early morning sky. Isabella hesitated before stepping inside, her footsteps echoing against the stone floor. Father Tomas was lighting candles near the altar, his movements slow and deliberate. His eyes met hers, and a flicker of recognition softened his expression. Isabella, he said, his voice calm yet tinged with curiosity. What brings you here at this hour? She approached him, her hands clasped tightly together. I need your help, Father. It's about my mother, and Don Rafael. At the mention of the name, Father Tomas stiffened. He set down the candle and turned to face her fully. Why are you asking about him? Isabella took a deep breath, her words spilling out in a torrent. She told him about the attack, Alejandro's accusations, and Carmen's cryptic revelations. When she finished, Father Tomas sighed heavily and gestured for her to sit in one of the pews. There's much you don't know about your family, he began. Your mother wanted it that way. She wanted to protect you. From what? Isabella pressed, her voice trembling. What does Don Rafael have to do with me? Father Tomas hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Don Rafael was your father. The words hit her like a thunderclap. Isabella stared at the priest, her mind racing. She had always wondered about the man in the faded photograph, but to hear his name now, tied to the chaos engulfing her life, left her reeling. He was a powerful man, Father Tomas continued, a leader in the underworld. But years ago, he disappeared. He left that life behind to protect his family. His enemies were too many, too dangerous. Your mother believed he died to keep you safe. Isabella's hands shook as she absorbed the revelation. But if he's dead, why would Alejandro come after me? Perhaps he isn't as dead as we thought, Father Tomas said gravely. Or perhaps Alejandro believes you know something about him, something that threatens his power. A knot tightened in Isabella's stomach. If her father was alive, why hadn't he come for her? And if he wasn't, why was she being hunted for his legacy? Before she could voice her questions, the sound of heavy boots echoed in the distance. Isabella's heart sank. Alejandro's men. Father Tomas quickly ushered her toward a hidden door behind the altar. Go, he urged. There's a passage that leads to the back of the church. Run, Isabella. She hesitated, guilt and fear warring within her. What about you? I'll be fine, he assured her. But you must stay alive. Find the truth. Isabella nodded, slipping through the door as the main entrance burst open. Her breath came in sharp gasps as she navigated the narrow passage, emerging into an overgrown garden behind the church. She didn't stop running until she was well into the maze of the city's alleyways. The priest's words echoed in her mind as she leaned against a wall, catching her breath. Don Rafael, her father. Alive or dead, he had left a trail that now placed her squarely in the crosshairs of a dangerous game. She couldn't run forever. If there were answers to be found, she would have to face the fire, even if it meant confronting Alejandro himself. The safe house Carmen had arranged for Isabella was little more than a crumbling apartment on the edge of the city. It smelled of damp concrete and abandonment, but it offered a sliver of security, or so she hoped. Isabella paced the small living room, her thoughts a whirlwind. The revelation about Don Rafael refused to leave her mind. If her father had been so deeply entrenched in this violent world, How far would Alejandro go to use her as leverage? Her answer came sooner than expected. The door exploded inward with a deafening crash. Splinters of wood flew across the room and Isabella froze, her heart hammering as Alejandro's men stormed in. This time, there was no opportunity to run. Their guns were drawn, their stares unyielding. One of them grabbed her roughly by the arm, and she struggled against his grip. "Enough!" a voice commanded from behind them. The man who entered carried an air of absolute authority. Alejandro was everything she had imagined, tall, sharp-featured, and exuding a presence that demanded obedience. His dark eyes locked onto hers, a predator sizing up its prey. The room felt smaller with him in it. "Isabella," he said, her name rolling off his tongue like a verdict. "You've caused quite the inconvenience." "I don't know what you're talking about," she snapped, her voice stronger than she expected. "I've done nothing to you." Alejandro's lips curved into a humorless smile. "Ignorance doesn't absolve you. You're connected to Don Rafael, and that makes you a threat." The mention of her father sent a jolt through her. "I have no connection to him. I barely even know who he is." Alejandro stepped closer, his gaze narrowing. "Do you think I'm a fool?" Don Rafael disappeared, yet his ghost lingers, stirring chaos. And now here you are, his daughter, denying everything. The room fell silent, the weight of his accusation pressing on her like a stone. She stared at him, anger flaring in her chest. "If my father left that life behind, then why are you so desperate to drag me into it?" Alejandro's jaw tightened, his composure cracking for the briefest moment. "Because Don Rafael didn't just vanish. He betrayed me. Everything I built, he dismantled. And now I find his bloodline standing in my way." Isabella's breath caught. Betrayal? Alejandro wasn't just hunting her for her father's legacy. This was personal. But as his words sank in, she noticed a flicker of something else in his expression. Doubt. "If you think I'm hiding something," she said, meeting his gaze, "then interrogate me. Prove your theories. But you won't find anything because I know nothing about my father's world." Alejandro studied her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he gestured to his men. "Bring her alive!" Panic surged as they dragged her toward the door. But in Alejandro's hesitation, Isabella saw an opportunity. He might be ruthless, but he was still searching for something he wasn't sure she had. As the car pulled away from the building, Isabella's resolve hardened. If Alejandro wanted answers about her father, she would find them first, and she would use them to escape this nightmare dot. The room they brought Isabella to was cold and dimly lit, its bare concrete walls radiating a sense of foreboding. She sat in a metal chair, her hands bound, as Alejandro entered with the deliberate stride of a man used to control. He pulled up a chair across from her, setting his gun on the table between them, as if to remind her of his authority. "I hope you're ready to talk," he said, his voice smooth but laced with menace. Isabella glared at him, her fear dulled by the anger coursing through her veins. "I've already told you. I know nothing about my father's world." Alejandro leaned back, his dark eyes scrutinizing her. "You're either the best liar I've ever met, or Don Rafael truly kept you in the dark. Either way, you're going to learn the truth." She scoffed, her frustration spilling over. "What truth? That my father was a criminal? That he destroyed lives? I don't need you to tell me that. I've seen what men like him leave behind." Alejandro's expression hardened, but there was a flicker of something else. A memory, perhaps, or a buried emotion. Don Rafael wasn't just a criminal. He was a king, and like all kings, he made enemies. He made choices that cost him everything, including his family. Isabella's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" Alejandro hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table for a brief moment before meeting hers again. "Years ago, your father saved my life. I was young and reckless, and he gave me a second chance when no one else would, but he also betrayed me, betrayed all of us. He tore down the foundations of my cartel, leaving me to pick up the pieces." The revelation hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Isabella struggled to reconcile the image of a man who had both saved lives and destroyed them. "Why would he do that?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "To protect you," Alejandro said simply. He dismantled everything to ensure no one could use his power against his family. But in doing so, he created enemies. Enemies who want you dead because you're his legacy. Isabella felt as though the room were closing in on her. Her father's actions, however noble they might have been in intent, had painted a target on her back. And now she was sitting across from a man who had every reason to hate him. "I'm not my father," she said firmly. If you want revenge, it won't come from me. Alejandro studied her, his expression unreadable. Maybe not, but you're the only link I have to him now. If he's alive, you'll help me find him. And if I don't, she challenged, her chin lifting defiantly. Then you'll die, Alejandro said bluntly, though his tone lacked the venom she expected. Despite the weight of his threat, Isabella saw the cracks in his armor. The man who had once admired her father, now caught between vengeance and the fragments of his own humanity. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. If her father had truly gone to such lengths to protect her, then she owed it to herself to uncover the full truth. Fine, she said, but if we're doing this, it'll be on my terms. Alejandro's brow arched, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. You're bold for someone in chains. I have nothing left to lose, Isabella shot back. The smirk faded, replaced by a nod. Then let's see what you're really made of. The uneasy truce between Isabella and Alejandro was forged in a moment of necessity. Alejandro's men had uncovered whispers of a rival cartel's movements, a faction that had grown bold, seeking to capitalize on Alejandro's preoccupation with hunting Isabella. The rival cartel posed a threat to them both, and for now, their survival depended on cooperation. The SUV rumbled down a dirt road, its headlights cutting through the early morning haze. Isabella sat in the back seat, her wrists finally freed but her movements still guarded. Alejandro sat beside her, his presence heavy, as though his authority filled the vehicle like an unseen weight. The tension between them was palpable. Where are we going? She asked, breaking the silence. To a warehouse on the outskirts, Alejandro replied without looking at her. Our enemies have been stockpiling weapons there. We'll hit them before they hit us. And what exactly do you expect me to do? Isabella asked, folding her arms. I'm a nurse, not a soldier. You're resourceful, Alejandro said simply. And you're here because you wanted answers. Consider this your chance to prove you're more than just a liability. His dismissive tone stung, but Isabella held her ground. She wasn't here to earn his respect. She was here to survive. If working alongside him meant getting closer to the truth about her father, then she would do what was necessary. When they arrived, the warehouse loomed like a fortress against the dusty horizon. Alejandro's men moved swiftly, communicating in clipped tones as they prepared for the assault. Isabella hung back, her unease growing with every passing second. Alejandro handed her a radio, his expression unreadable. Stay close to me, he said, and don't do anything stupid. The operation began with precision. Alejandro's men breached the perimeter, their weapons trained on every shadow. Inside, the warehouse was a labyrinth of crates and machinery, the air thick with the smell of oil and tension. It wasn't long before the silence erupted into chaos. Gunfire echoed off the metal walls, and Isabella found herself pressed against a stack of crates, her heart pounding. She clenched the radio in her hand, resisting the urge to close her eyes against the violence unfolding around her. A shout nearby drew her attention. One of Alejandro's men had been hit, blood pooling beneath him as he struggled to breathe. Without thinking, Isabella darted from her hiding spot and knelt beside him. Her hands moved instinctively, pressing against the wound to stem the bleeding. Hold still, she murmured, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her. Through the chaos, she felt Alejandro's gaze on her. When the fighting subsided, he approached, his expression hard, but his eyes carrying a glint of something softer. You saved him, he said, his tone more of a statement than a question. I did what anyone would do, Isabella replied, standing to face him. Even in your world, life has value. Alejandro didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced around the room, taking in the defeated enemies and the battered state of his own men. Your father once told me something similar, he said quietly, almost to himself. Isabella froze. What do you mean? He believed in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, Alejandro said, meeting her gaze. It was one of the few things about him I respected. The admission unsettled her. This man, who had been so determined to see her as an enemy, now showed glimpses of the humanity buried beneath his hardened exterior. As they left the warehouse, Isabella realized that the lines between ally and adversary were beginning to blur. Alejandro wasn't the man she'd expected, and she wasn't sure whether that made him more or less dangerous. For now, their alliance held. But the secrets they uncovered together would test the fragile bond they had begun to build. The aftermath of the warehouse assault left both Alejandro and Isabella grappling with the uneasy alliance they had formed. The shared danger had created a fragile understanding, but the questions surrounding Don Rafael's legacy hung over them like a storm cloud. The narrow mountain road wound higher, the SUV struggling to navigate the loose gravel. Alejandro drove in silence, his eyes fixed ahead, while Isabella stared out the window at the dense forest below. They had intercepted a lead, rumors that someone fitting Don Rafael's description had been spotted at a remote safe house. Neither of them spoke about what finding him might mean. "You're quiet," Alejandro said finally, breaking the silence. "What do you expect me to say?" Isabella shot back. "That I'm thrilled to be chasing ghosts with you?" Alejandro smirked, a flash of his sharp confidence breaking through. "You could at least admit you're curious. You want answers as much as I do." She didn't reply, though he wasn't wrong. The possibility of finding her father, alive after all these years, was both exhilarating and terrifying. But she couldn't ignore the lingering doubt. Why had he stayed hidden? Why had he let her believe he was dead? As the road leveled out, they approached a secluded cabin, barely visible through the dense trees. Alejandro motioned for silence, and his men moved with practiced precision, encircling the building. Isabella stayed close to him, her nerves on edge. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit, the faint smell of wood smoke hanging in the air. It appeared abandoned, save for a single figure seated at a worn table in the center of the room. The man's back was to them, but Isabella recognized the outline instantly. Broad shoulders, silver-streaked hair, and an air of quiet authority. "Don Rafael!" Alejandro called out, his voice sharp and commanding. The man turned slowly, and Isabella's breath caught. His face was older than she remembered from the photograph, etched with lines of hardship and regret, but there was no mistaking him. Her father. "Isabella," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of years lost. She couldn't move, her emotions warring between relief, anger, and disbelief. Alejandro stepped forward, his gun drawn but pointed down. "You've been hiding a long time," he said, his tone cold. "Time to explain why." Don Rafael's gaze shifted to Alejandro, unflinching. "I had no choice. Staying meant putting everyone I loved in danger. Leaving was the only way to protect her." "Protect me?" Isabella's voice cracked as she found her footing. "You let me think you were dead. Do you know what that did to us? To me?" Don Rafael's expression faltered, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "I did it for you, Isabella. The enemies I made. They would have come for you. I couldn't let that happen." Alejandro scoffed. "And yet here we are. Your daughter hunted. Your name's still a curse. Was it worth it?" Rafael didn't respond immediately. Instead, he rose slowly, his movements deliberate. "I never wanted this life for her. But if you're here, it means the fight isn't over. The rival cartel, they're a threat to us all." Isabella's fists clenched. "And what about the threat you left behind? Alejandro is here because of you too." Rafael's gaze softened as he looked at her. "Alejandro has his reasons, but so do I. Whatever hatred he has for me, we both know the enemy we face now is far worse." The tension in the room crackled like electricity. Alejandro's jaw tightened, but he nodded begrudgingly. "For now, we'll fight together. But don't mistake this for forgiveness." Rafael nodded, his eyes returning to Isabella. "I'll explain everything, but first we need to survive." For the first time, Isabella saw the man behind the legend. He was flawed, burdened, but undeniably human. As much as she hated him for the choices he had made, she couldn't deny the truth. He was her father, and their lives were now inextricably tied. The cabin was silent, save for the low crackle of the fire. Isabella sat at the edge of the table, her eyes darting between Alejandro and her father. The two men seemed locked in an unspoken battle of wills, their mutual disdain palpable. Yet there was no denying the gravity of the situation. The rival cartel loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon, and survival demanded cooperation. Don Rafael leaned forward, his hands resting on the table as he addressed Alejandro. "Their leader, Emilio Vargas, won't stop until he controls everything. He's not just coming for you. He's coming for everyone who opposes him." Alejandro crossed his arms, his expression stony. "I know what Vargas wants, but why should I trust you? You've already betrayed everyone who followed you." Isabella flinched at the sharpness in Alejandro's voice, but Don Rafael remained composed. "I did what I had to do to protect my family. And whether you like it or not, we share a common enemy now." "What's your plan then?" Alejandro pressed, his tone skeptical. Don Rafael straightened, his voice steady. "Vargas has a weapons shipment arriving in 2 days at the port. If we intercept it, we cripple his supply chain and send a message. but it'll take precise coordination and people we can trust. Alejandro narrowed his eyes. You mean my people? I mean our people, Rafael corrected. This isn't about loyalty anymore. It's about survival. Isabella watched the exchange, her unease growing. And what happens after? Even if you take down Vargas, what's stopping another cartel from filling the void? Her father's gaze softened as he turned to her. We can't erase the violence overnight, Isabella, but this is a step toward reclaiming our lives. Your life. Isabella shook her head, her frustration boiling over. You talk about reclaiming my life like it's something you ever cared about. You left, Rafael. You left me to deal with the fallout. I know, Rafael said quietly, and I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my days. But right now, I'm asking for your help, not for me, for the people who'll suffer if Vargas takes over. Alejandro leaned back in his chair, his sharp gaze shifting between father and daughter. Touching as this family reunion is, we don't have time for sentimentality. If we're doing this, we do it my way. Agreed? Rafael gave a curt nod. Agreed. The conversation shifted to logistics, Rafael outlining his knowledge of the port and the shipment's expected arrival. Isabella listened intently, her role unclear but unavoidable. Despite her resentment, she couldn't deny the truth. The lives of countless innocents hung in the balance. As the fire burned lower, the three of them reached a tenuous agreement. They would strike together, blending Rafael's knowledge, Alejandro's resources, and Isabella's determination. It was a fragile alliance, built on necessity rather than trust. For Isabella, the coming days would be a test, not just of survival, but of who she would become in the shadow of her father's choices. The port was a labyrinth of towering metal containers stacked haphazardly under the dim glow of floodlights. The salty tang of the ocean mixed with the oil-slick air, creating a heavy atmosphere that mirrored the tension among Rafael, Alejandro, and Isabella. The mission was simple in theory but fraught with danger. Intercept Vargas's weapons shipment, cripple his operations, and send a message that would reverberate through the underworld. Isabella crouched behind a stack of crates, her pulse pounding in her ears. She clutched a small first aid kit tightly, the one contribution she insisted on bringing. Though not a fighter, she refused to remain passive in this fight. Alejandro's men moved silently around them, their dark clothing blending with the shadows as they prepared for the ambush. Rafael knelt beside her, his voice low and steady. Stay close. If things go wrong, head for the exit I showed you. No hesitation. I'm not leaving, Isabella whispered back, her jaw set with determination. Not until this is over. Her father nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes before turning to Alejandro. They'll unload at the southern dock. We need to hit hard and fast before they know we're here. Alejandro gave a sharp nod, signaling his men with a hand gesture. His eyes lingered on Isabella for a moment longer than necessary. Stay out of the line of fire. She didn't dignify his comment with a response. As the team moved into position, the sound of heavy engines signaled the arrival of Vargas's convoy. Trucks rumbled into view, flanked by armed guards. Isabella's breath caught as she saw the sheer number of men surrounding the shipment. The first shot rang out, sharp and deafening. Alejandro's men opened fire from the shadows, chaos erupting as Vargas's guards scrambled for cover. Rafael moved with surprising agility, his years of experience evident as he directed the assault. Alejandro was a force of nature, his commands cutting through the chaos as he led the charge. Isabella stayed low, her hands trembling as she tried to focus on her surroundings. The fight was brutal, the air filled with the cacophony of gunfire and shouted orders. She spotted one of Alejandro's men collapse nearby, blood pooling beneath him. Without thinking, she darted forward, her medical instincts overriding her fear. She worked quickly, pressing a bandage against the man's wound. "You'll be okay," she muttered, her voice trembling. A shadow loomed over her. Isabella looked up to see a guard aiming his rifle at her. Before she could react, a gunshot echoed, and the man crumpled to the ground. She turned to see Rafael, his pistol still raised, his expression unreadable. "Stay focused," he said before moving on. The tide of the battle shifted as Rafael's plan unfolded. Explosives planted earlier detonated, scattering Vargas's men and destroying key parts of the shipment. Victory seemed within reach until Isabella heard a shout, a voice that made her blood run cold. "Rafael!" It was Vargas, stepping into view, flanked by reinforcements. His men sprayed bullets indiscriminately, forcing Alejandro's team into retreat. Rafael stood his ground, his face grim. No! Isabella cried as she realized his intent. He wasn't retreating. He was sacrificing himself. Raphael turned to her, his eyes softening. Take care of yourself, Isabella. Live the life I couldn't give you. Before she could stop him, he charged toward Vargas's men, drawing their fire and creating the opening Alejandro needed to finish the mission. The explosion that followed lit up the night, engulfing the dock in a fiery inferno. Isabella screamed, her legs giving way as Alejandro pulled her back to safety. The battle was won, but the cost was immeasurable. As dawn broke over the smoldering remains of the port, Isabella stared into the distance, tears streaming down her face. Her father was gone, but his sacrifice had ensured her survival. And perhaps a chance for something better. The morning sun cast long shadows across the smoldering ruins of the port. Isabella stood at the edge of the water, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as the waves lapped gently at the shore. The events of the night replayed in her mind like a haunting echo, the gunfire, the chaos, and her father's final, selfless act. Alejandro approached her quietly, his usual commanding presence subdued. He stopped a few steps away, his hands in his pockets, and for a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy, but not hostile. He did what he thought was right, Alejandro said finally, his voice low. It wasn't just for you, it was for all of us. Isabella didn't look at him. It doesn't make it easier. No, Alejandro admitted. It doesn't. For a long time, they stood in silence, watching as the remnants of the port operation were cleared away by Alejandro's men. The rival cartel had been dismantled, their power broken, but the victory felt hollow to Isabella. Her father's sacrifice weighed too heavily for her to feel anything like triumph. I'm done with this life, Alejandro said suddenly, his voice breaking the stillness. Isabella turned to look at him, her eyes narrowing slightly in surprise. Your father's sacrifice. It made me realize something. This endless cycle of violence, betrayal, it doesn't lead anywhere. I don't want to end up like him. Isabella studied him, searching for any hint of insincerity, but his expression was resolute. And what will you do? I have resources, Alejandro said. Enough to build something better, maybe a farm, far from all of this, a quiet life. She almost laughed at the image, but there was no humor in it. A quiet life, she echoed. I wouldn't have thought that's what you wanted. I didn't know it was, he admitted. Until now. Isabella looked back at the horizon, the soft hues of dawn painting the sky in gentle colors. I don't know what I'll do, she said honestly, but I can't let my father's sacrifice be in vain. There's a clinic in the city, one I worked at before all this. They need resources, staff, security. Maybe I'll start there. Alejandro nodded. You'll make a difference, you always have. For the first time since the night began, Isabella felt a glimmer of hope. Her father's legacy didn't have to be defined by violence or fear. It could be something better, something healing. She turned to Alejandro, extending her hand. Good luck, Alejandro. He took her hand, his grip firm but not overbearing. You too, Isabella. With that, they parted ways, Alejandro walking toward the waiting SUV, and Isabella turning back toward the city. The path ahead of her was uncertain, but she was no longer running from her past. Instead, she was ready to rebuild, to honor the sacrifices made for her, and to forge a future defined not by fear, but by strength. In the end, Isabella's journey reminds us that the choices we make, even those driven by love and protection, can ripple through generations. Her father's sacrifice and her courage to face the truth show us the strength it takes to rebuild from pain and create a new path. But the question lingers. If you were in her shoes, torn between fear, loyalty, and survival, what would you have done? Would you have confronted the shadows of the past or tried to escape them? Click the video on your screen to continue this journey of self-discovery and uncover the lessons hidden in Isabella's story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful tales that challenge us to think, feel, and grow. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.